Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Eckert and I'm a conservation scientist. I call myself a conservation scientist as a little bit of a made-up term. I also like to think of myself as a conservation scientist as a scientist with an identity crisis. I'm both a natural scientist and a social scientist, meaning I have one foot in the world of ecology and biology and the other well placed in the world of understanding humans as groups, humans as individuals. I think it's really important today to start off by talking about conservation as an endeavor that centers and includes humans in the process of understanding ecosystems and how we can better our relationships with them. So today I'm going to share with you insight into my PhD research here at the University of Victoria in the Department of Geography. And I'm going to talk about research that was scheduled to begin this April, but is now expectedly paused due to COVID-19. And it's new for me to talk about research that's still in development, but I think now is a really critical time for us all to think about our relationship with our wild neighbors, with all animals, non-human animals on the planet. And so I'm going to go ahead and give you an introduction to a lot of the work that I will planning to be doing when it is safe to resume my research. And before I launch in, I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am standing here today as a visitor on Wasanich, Lekwungen, and Songhees territory. And I would like to take a moment to not simply tokenize that land acknowledgement, but think about, reflect on what that acknowledgement means for me as a scholar and me as a human. Reflect now, pause and reflect on the ways that I have directly and indirectly benefited from violent historical and modern colonization of Indigenous peoples. It is my responsibility as a human, a scholar, a researcher, and a conservation scientist to reflect deeply on these ways that I've benefited from colonization and also recognize that it is my responsibility to thus engage in decolonial, anti-racist research that sets itself both within the goals of sciences and recognizes the way science has historically marginalized communities or promoted colonization, and that we as a new wave of scientists can pursue progressive research that recognizes human rights alongside our conservation goals. And I also want to take a moment to talk about the location that the research I'll describe later today will occur in, and that is in an area called the Sunshine Coast, Powell River and Lund, the Katet Regional District. It goes by many names, but it is also the territory of the Tla'amin Nation, who continue to have a relationship with the lands that they have stewarded since time immemorial to this day. And now I want to launch in to some of these really important conversations that are ongoing globally about human-wildlife relationships. And I think a really good natural place to start today is in thinking about COVID-19, a zoonotic disease that was transferred from non-human animals to human animals. And I think all of us now, as we sit down, spend more time slowing down, more time at home, time away from our desks, we're all called to this opportunity to think about even the invisible human-wildlife relationships, the relationships we have with wildlife in the world that we don't always see. I have bats pictured on the screen because along with COVID-19 have come certain beliefs about the danger of bats as harborers and harbingers for coronaviruses. And rather than stoking fear or misunderstanding about wildlife, I think that the conditions that led to the COVID-19 outbreak are something we can all collectively reflect on. And we can recognize that those conditions, exploitation of wildlife in an unsustainable manner in which wildlife were congregated in small areas for human use, those conditions are present in many species beyond those that harbor coronaviruses and all over the world, including in Canada and the USA. And so this is this potent moment to think about the fact that our poor relationships with wildlife or our unsustainable exploitation of wildlife impact the health of every single one of us. And so this is an opportunity, starting big, to think about these relationships with wildlife, to recognize the interrelated health of every living thing on this planet, and to start reimagining those relationships. And when we think about human, non-human animal relationships, there's a wide diversity of what those might look like, both for each of us and for diverse humans. So we may think about conflict in our backyards with bears or smaller mammals. We have lots of domesticated non-human animals that we have individual and collective relationships with. We have animals that we ourselves exploit for food or other uses. And all of these relationships, our caring relationships, our use-oriented relationships, our entertainment-related relationships that have also been on display in the last several months, are relationships that are not as direct relationships of the structures we build to the wildlife it influences. All of these relationships are starting points to think deeply about how we connect to wildlife and why we connect to them that way. And in line with my territorial acknowledgement, I also want to take a second now to talk about the fact that when we say the word relationships in a conventional context or in a Western context, that term often is used to speak about humans, human-human relationships, individual-to-individual relationships. And in the case of Western society and colonial US and Canada, that relationship between human and nature has often been defined by domination or separation, that humans and wildlife, humans and natural landscapes are separate. And it's worthwhile here to note that these relationships that we now seek to reimagine and redefine, we don't need to reinvent the wheel as we seek to do that, as we seek to reinvent relationships, because they're indigenous theories, praxis, relationships that exist globally that provide an alternative definition of relationships that are inherently related to interconnection between all living things, that are steeped in the roots of relationships, in values, in culture, and also that recognize reciprocity as a key element of a relationship, a good relationship between people and people, but also between people and the wildlife and other animals that we come into contact with. And so as we begin to examine our individual and collective journeys towards human-wildlife relationships, I want to start at my own beginning. In this image I'm sharing on the screen, I'm about 7 years old, and at the time, admittedly, my parents were a little concerned I would never want to be a human being. I was always in a mode of playing pretend that I was an animal. Very early on, I was on a path toward conservation science and ecology. I was fascinated by wildlife. I wanted to understand as much as I could about local and far away wildlife. And I often wonder now, as I expand my scholarship into the social sciences and to understanding what makes us as a species tick, what caused me to be set so early on that path toward conservation science? What early experiences did I have? What stories, what values, what beliefs drove me individually to want to dress up as a leopard and also to want to pursue a career learning more about wildlife? And I wonder that about humans in general. And one thing I ask you today to do is reflect on what stories you tell yourselves, what beliefs or values drive our decisions and emotions as they relate to wildlife and other non-human animals. And so now I'll return a little bit closer to home as we start thinking about ourselves and those values. And very close to home for many of us here on University of Victoria's campus. So in my research today, I want to start thinking about those deep roots of our relationships, those values-oriented roots of relationships, through the lens of a large, charismatic animal, particularly and unusually close to home right now in Victoria, and that is the black bear. So black bears, as many of you know, are omnivorous like us, like humans. They're a large mammal found across North America, and they can weigh between 40 and 140 kilograms and are very inherently curious in nature, which leads them frequently into relationships with their human neighbors. bears can also smell up to 20 miles. And so that also spurs them into relationships with humans for sometimes negative reasons, like our attractants, our outdoor food sources, whether they be trash, berries, fruit trees, gardens, pet food, that can lead them into conflict with humans. And black bear human conflict is a really serious problem in North America in general, but particularly here in British Columbia. Consequences of conflict are far-reaching and can include things like property damage, food loss, or injury to humans. And for individual bears, frequently result in suffering or death as conservation officers and others respond to bears in human environments. So to give you a little idea of scale of human black bear conflict, here on the screen is a map made available through WildSafe BC. And this screen represents, with little bear figures, all of the conflict calls or sightings calls related to black bears near human settlements since June 1st. So this is just over 2 weeks of reported bear conflicts and sightings in the province. And here's that same information for southern Vancouver Island. I think here in Victoria, we often feel a bit removed from the impacts of human bear conflict. But as we've been reminded in the past couple of weeks, and as this map can serve to remind us, that conflict is in fact in our veritable backyards. And so in 2019 alone, 18,000 conflicts or sightings were reported to WildSafe BC or to conservation officers in the region. 11,000 of those were direct conflict reports. And in 2019, over 470 bears had to be destroyed by conservation officers because they were habituated, meaning they were returning over and over again to neighborhoods to eat food, and thus posed a threat to individual humans or humans' pets. So the scale of this problem is large, and it impacts us both individually and collectively as a province as we seek resources to mitigate that conflict and to deal with that conflict on the ground. So it's really important for scientists and practitioners and individuals who live in bear neighborhoods to understand, examine, and be able to predict and mitigate conflict between humans and black bears, both locally and more broadly. And this will help avoid human suffering, expensive losses to human properties in the province, but also to reduce individual bear suffering. So typically, scientists and practitioners have pursued mitigation of conflict by studying natural environments, human-built environments at the large spatial scale, the top-down scale, and then honing in on what factors from those environments most often lead to conflict. So these are variables like proximity between bears and humans, number of bears or density of humans in an area, proximity of humans to bear habitat, and attractants, so things like garbage, fruit trees, berries left out by humans. And what we know from previous work in human-wildlife conflict studies is that in the province, for instance, over 60% of reported conflicts were due to garbage left out as an attractant for bears. As I said, bears can smell huge distances. So if this human is close to bear habitat and is close to bears that are hungry, we can expect conflict between bears and humans. So this is sort of where our knowledge base lies in understanding conflict between humans and bears. So what we want to think about today is how do we go deeper from that understanding? So armed with this data that I shared in the last slide and this understanding of what attractants might lead to conflict and what environments might lead to conflict, many organizations, scientists, and professionals in the province and beyond have put immense amounts of work into establishing education programs that help people and communities manage their attractants and decrease their conflict with bears. But despite all of this work, conflict with bears seems to continue at staggering rates, even increasing in the last several decades in the province. So there's obviously more to the story to what causes conflict and how we can ameliorate it than simply understanding what an environment looks like and what attractants are present. And so here's where we come back to this idea of diving deeper into understanding what makes us as humans tick. It turns out, as scientists have started looking deeper into problems of conflict, that there are a number of variables that emerge as important in predicting where conflict is going to occur and who's going to be involved in it. So those are variables like I have up on screen now: perception of risk, past experiences of an individual and the emotions those experiences created. Has someone had an attack on themselves from a bear? Have they had a bear damage their property? Have they had positive experiences with bears? Maybe some of their best moments have been sightings of bears from a safe distance in nature. What sort of deep-rooted values do humans bring to the table when we think about bears? Values can be really hard to articulate because they're sort of a foundational guiding set of principles that we live by, often without even being able to name or know. What sort of beliefs do we have as they relate to bears? Do we believe we need to be afraid of bears? Do we believe we need to be wary of bears? Do we believe it doesn't matter how we behave around bears? Our opinions related to bears and bear management policy play important roles in how we interact with bears. Our trust in local authorities, such as conservation officer services or other municipal authorities to handle bear conflict, has a role in how we end up reacting to bears when we run into them. And all of these things together, plus many other variables, end up resulting in our behavior. And that behavior plays a role in whether we attract conflict or mitigate it. And the same deep-rooted questions can be asked about bears, and many scientists have for many years. So questions like, how close is the bear's habitat to human settlements, and how intact is that habitat? Does that habitat have enough space to support the number of bears within it? How old is the bear? Is the bear male or female? Is it of reproduction age or not? Does it have cubs? What is food availability like in the bear's natural habitat? Some of the worst recorded years for conflict in the province have been in low berry years. So black bears actually rely a lot on plants, including berries, to fatten up over the winter before hibernation. And in low berry years, we've seen huge spikes in conflict with people as availability of food decreases and bears get braver because they're hungry about going into neighborhoods that are dangerous for them. Bears also have past experiences with humans that inform and color how they make decisions about where they're going to seek food. So for instance, a cub who is exposed to high density, high quality food in a garbage can at a young age, say a Big Mac readily available with very little work to access, is going to store that memory as a driver to return to those places and seek that garbage, that easy access, high caloric density food again in the future. And all of these things together result in behavior for the bear. So these collective drivers are going to be what drives that bear to either end up in conflict or in coexistence with its neighbors. So together, these variables, which we've just looked through, paint a much more nuanced and complex picture of all of the interrelated aspects of humans and bears that together inform relationships. So rather than simply seeking answers from environments or large-scale spatial data, we are interested as a team of scientists, and my PhD research will attempt to start digging into some of these deep-rooted drivers of conflict towards better predicting behavior that leads to conflict, and ultimately towards suggesting new ways, nuanced ways, to mitigate that conflict towards coexistence. So all of these predictors that we've just discussed not only have strong and resounding impacts on humans, but bears themselves. So here's an image of some black bear cubs whose mama has downed a bird feeder and who are happily eating away on the high-calorie seeds therein. Here's an image of two young black bear cubs who were happy in the wild at a safe distance from humans. though not admittedly as happy as those two black bears on the left look, though temporarily. And so these early experiences for bears, these predictors of humans using attractants in their yards, even unintentionally, can result in really different consequences for adult bears. So here we see a bear that was tranquilized in Vancouver for repeatedly returning to a neighborhood, and two bears living in the wild using food resources that are natural to that bear and don't put it in harm's way. So our research seeks to get answers on this huge suite of aspects of humans and of bears to help us understand which aspects of ourselves and of bears are most instrumental in causing conflict or allowing for coexistence. So for my planned research, some of which may be able to move forward this summer, there are two ways we go about doing this. And the first way is surveys and interviews with people. So being a social scientist is a blessing because while for black bears, we have to do all sorts of work to get approximations of why bears do what they do, we can ask people. And so my surveys will include lots of questions about past experiences, values as they relate to wildlife. So instruments, social survey instruments, which have a way to measure and approximate human values. We'll ask about the number of bears people see on their property, about how they interact with those bears, and a whole suite of questions attending to all of those variables we listed as driving conflict or coexistence from the human side of things. And I'll also engage in trying to learn more about bears in the Sunshine Coast region. And the way that I'll do that is via camera traps, so wildlife cameras set up on people's properties with permission that will take photos at regular intervals and anytime movement is detected in the foreground of the camera. And so this will allow us to get an idea of what bears are doing when they're visiting folks' properties. And our sign surveys where we look for things like bear tracks, bear scat, damage caused by bears, bear rub trees, bear scratches. These will help us understand the difference, get an idea of the difference of abundance of bears across different areas in the Sunshine Coast region. And here's a wonderful visual of a camera trap. So camera trapping is a non-invasive method that can provide us insight into the behavior of bears. And our surveys will allow us to measure all of these aspects of human beings that are complicated, but that we can access through our shared language. And it's going to be really interesting in this research to see how these two aspects of ecosystems of neighborhoods align. Are we going to find more conflict when we see more bears on our camera traps? Are we going to find less conflict than we predict based on the number of bears in a given neighborhood? Where we find less conflict, what can we learn about the people in that neighborhood if they are managing their attractants really well? What values inform those decisions to manage their attractants? I think something that's really important to recognize when starting to talk about this space between how many bears are in a neighborhood and how likely there is for conflict to occur and how humans are reacting to those bears in their presence. There's often an assumption that many individuals don't tolerate bears in their neighborhood and that those are the individuals ending up in conflict with bears. But there's a diversity of values and beliefs as they relate to bears that can lead to conflict. So for instance, say you're an individual who cares deeply about bears and loves seeing them in your yard. You are more likely to perhaps leave a bird feeder out that bears will munch on every once in a while because you are at a distance to that bear, respect that bear, and like to see it eating. Unfortunately, bears don't recognize boundaries between different yards. So while one person may be very tolerant of a bear in their backyard, that attractant that brings a bear into their yard may lead that bear to visit a neighbor who isn't comfortable with a bear in their yard, and rightly so. Bears can pose risks to pets, children, and people. And the best relationship we can have with bears is a distant one in our own appropriate setting. So there's a diversity of things that could ultimately lead to conflict, not simply intolerance of black bears. And so together, this examination that dives into the deep roots of both social, human, and ecological aspects of neighborhoods in the Quetet Regional District will help us understand who is most likely to engage in conflict and why. And that who goes for bears and humans. And it will also help us understand where conflict is most likely to occur. And what we can do with this information, this data that will result from this research, is to better hone our energy when it comes to educational outreach and habitat restoration for bears. So for instance, collaborating organizations like WildSafe BC know that educational programming works best when the educational material fits with the values of the individual being educated. And I think we can all attest to that and understand it. We're more likely to change our behavior when when our values are supported through that behavior change, when that behavior can still align with our core values and beliefs. And so the way we can approach that is by tailoring education messages to meet people where they are, rather than having a blanket educational message for everyone in a region to avoid bear conflict. And this can also allow us to understand why bears may be ending up in situations of conflict. Is it because of a lack of food availability? Is their access to berries, fruits, sedge grasses, and salmon really limited in certain locations? And what can we do as ecologists and as decision makers to make sure that that access is restored to a point that bears don't feel forced into neighborhoods and garbage cans to have access to the food they need? And so through this data and the interventions that can follow it, our hope is that ultimately collaborators like WildSafe BC and other organizations can promote education that leads to people avoiding conflict. So managing attractants like garbage, harvesting all fruit from fruit trees, fencing gardens and chickens with electric fences, making sure pets aren't off leash in areas where bears live, such as trails. And on the bear side of things, our data can work towards informing why bears might engage in conflict. If bears that are in small forest patches, for instance, are always the ones engaging in conflict, that's important information to understand how to manage that population and support it so it stays out of our backyards. Together, these changes can lead to coexistence. And that coexistence is what we're aiming for on the global, on the national, on the provincial scale. But reaching that coexistence can only happen by changes made first at the individual scale. And so ultimately, we envision this reimagining of our relationship with bears, our individual and our collective relationship with black bears, from bears that end up in our trash cans, full of calories, but habituated to humans and thus putting themselves and us in danger, to relationships where this bear, pictured here, was fishing in a salmon stream and nowhere near human beings. So these bears have access to the food they need and are far away from our property, our yards, our pets, our kids, our families. And they can still be interactive. We still are in relationship with these black bears, but the best thing we can do for them is make sure that relationship is from very, very far away. And so I have two party notes today as I start to wrap up this explanation of research that will soon begin. First, wildlife relationships are of course not exclusive to humans and black bears. The same diverse drivers that I've talked about today apply to all of us as we relate to the wildlife in our own backyards, whether those wildlife are rodents like mice, are insects, are birds, deer and other ungulates like elk and moose, raccoons, the list goes on. I know one result of quarantine and social distancing measures for me is that I've been at home a lot more often and thus noticing the animals in my own backyard significantly more than I would have before. And that's saying something because I'm a conservation scientist who used to dress up as a leopard and play pretend as a kid. So I have a keen eye for wildlife in my backyard, but there was a lot that I was missing before I'd been home, working, slowing down and paying more attention. And what I encourage you all to do today, and what I've been working on doing myself as I navigate this self-isolation period, this time at home, and also this research, is to reflect on what drives my relationship with animals. What values inform how I relate to the rat that skitters across my back porch versus the crow that flies overhead? One example of a relationship I have with wildlife in my backyard that I didn't recognize until recently was a little finch in April who would return to my back porch over and over again to harvest dog hairs on the back porch and then fly away to add them to her nest. So this is a relationship which was mutually beneficial for the two of us. She was collecting dog hairs off my back porch, which I have plenty of in my house and am in no need of. And I was getting the joy of like watching a little thing work away at the floors of my porch as I sat and worked at my kitchen table. So thinking more deeply about these relationships with not just black bears, but all of these things that we live with day to day that we can visually see, I think is a really great way to start the process of reimagining global relationships with wildlife and assessing what we value and how we can put those values into actions that can better our own lives as well as the lives of non-human animals. And so finally, I'll return to where I started today on reflecting on relationships and what we can learn, not just from this research into the deep roots of conflict between human beings and wildlife, but also what we can learn from this really challenging, scary moment that is a global pandemic and COVID-19. And I think, as I mentioned early, this moment is a call to recognize that we cannot escape the consequences of a poor relationship between ourselves and wildlife. That our well-being is directly linked to the well-being, not just of the black bear that's getting into our garbage, who's impacting our well-being while he's being harmed, but also to the pangolin who is exploited for human use, or to the other non-human animals in our backyards and beyond who are likewise exploited unsustainably. And through thinking about things like values, beliefs, opinions, both the ones that are obvious to us and unobvious, and then thinking about how these apply and inform relationships to raccoons, bears, birds in our backyard, but also to what we buy, what we eat, what we support. This can allow us to take our values and enact them on both local scales by managing our attractants in our backyard, by putting away those bird feeders if we have black bears nearby, or by supporting conservation organizations globally that work to restructure our relationship with wildlife or avoid unsustainable exploitation, for instance, that can lead to zoonotic diseases that impact all of us. And so that's my final call to us all today, to realize that human-wildlife relationships are ever present for all of us, even when we don't realize it. And in this time of COVID-19, we're reminded that those relationships define our individual and collective health and well-being on this planet that we all share. And so I hope to have research updates for everyone in the forthcoming year and years as I explore these deep roots of conflict and work towards opportunities for coexistence on the Sunshine Coast. And I am also happy to hear from anyone who's interested in hearing more about the project, who has comments or experiences they want to share. And you're also welcome to follow me on social media, where I'll share information with the research as it evolves. So thank you very much today for joining me, and I look forward to hearing from you if you'd like to reach out.